1 2. Nakupata, unanipata? Niko kwa English 1 channel. First English, twende French.
Yeah, so okay. Hello, good morning. Are you getting me? That belongs to me. Getting you clearly? Getting you clearly? Yeah, very clear. Okay. Bonjour. Bonjour, ça va?
French, not clear. Can't hear you. The mic is on. The other mic on export should be off. No, it's okay. Ça va? Oui, ça va? Oui. Merci.
Agencies together to address the challenges.
Kenya's coastal zone. It seems prosperous and fertile, but looks can deceive. There are economic and environmental challenges and insecurity in some areas too.
In Kenya today, the coastal region is actually considered the poorest of all the regions. The poverty rate right now stands at 62%. We have poor communities that rely on the sea for daily bread, for fish, and they will overfish simply because they need to harvest to meet their daily needs. Infrastructure is coming up. We have mining, large-scale farming, and these are becoming threats to the marine environment in terms of runoff, of sedimentation.
Inland degradation associated with these development activities impacts directly on marine ecosystems, and fish stocks suffer. From inland ridge to coastal reef, the whole landscape is interconnected. From a deforested ridge through the farm slopes to the lowland forestry onto the mangroves, the seagrass beds, and the reef. People, their livelihoods, ecosystems, and natural resources all are intertwined. Naturally, investment needs at the coast are not the same as in Kenya's highlands. The Principal Secretary outlines those differences.
Of course, it's not about coffee. It's also not about the tea. It's about those crops, those water resources, the fishing, the aquaculture out there that would be used by the people as a springboard to economic development.
The coast now has its own development initiative. Jacqueline Oko is the coordinator.
The Kenya Coastal Development Project grew out of the need to bring government agencies together to address the challenges I've talked about.
Through KCDP, 7 government agencies have formed a platform to specially plan, coordinate, and monitor development covering both marine and inland resources. Action is coordinated by this platform, while communities are the main vehicle for implementation from ridge to reef. On the upper part of the ridge, the Shimba Hills National Reserve is home to Kenya's only population of sable antelope. It is also rich in indigenous vegetation and biodiversity. This ecosystem delivers vital services, especially water, for coastal communities. KCDP's support has strengthened the protection of the reserve. But outside this conserved area, land degradation has increased in recent decades due to deforestation. This has led to loss of soil fertility and sedimentation in streams. KCDP addresses land degradation by protecting riverbanks with trees and promoting woodlots. This reduces the amount of precious soil lost, soil that is carried down to the coast where it pollutes marine ecosystems. Trees not only sequester carbon but also build resilience into the landscape. While woodlots help protect the middle reaches of the landscape, there is one important activity that has not yet been sufficiently addressed.
The farmers here, they are still using the traditional methods, so there is a risk of soil erosion. So we need to adopt modern land husbandry technologies. So in a scenario where the land management is poor, the sediments will affect the mangroves, they will kill the seagrass beds, and finally also affect the coral reefs due to sediment deposition.
Clearly, better farming practices need more attention. To support woodlots and increase vegetative cover, KCDP provides training in finance. For example, to Mosito Women's Group to establish tree nurseries. They sell seedlings. But the group practices what it preaches too. Each member plants trees at home.
After planting the cassarina and baobab, I saw that my farm became more fertile. These trees are not bad. They're good for the farm.
One of the project's key strategies is to reach local communities through a targeted development fund, Hazina ya Maendeleo ya Pwani, as it is known in Kiswahili. Farid Hassan leads HMP.
So this process allows them, to come up with the idea of what they want to do, and then you give them the resources for them to manage. So it's kind of empowering, it's enriching, it's actually an eye-opener for them.
KCDP backs up this fund with research, technology, knowledge, and market information. It's development, but in each case, there are environmental benefits too. One project-supported community is the Dabaso Creek Conservation Group. Here, mangrove management and mud crab farming run side by side, and a resource center is the focal point for environmental education.
We come here so as we can learn more about mangroves, because at school we are not taught about maybe mangroves, we are just taught about forests.
Emily is shown how mangroves play a vital role as habitats for marine biodiversity. They are breeding grounds for fish. Furthermore, they capture carbon as they grow and support honeybees too. With the newly conserved mangroves come livelihood opportunities. Members are trained in crab fattening. A community restaurant established by a previous project serves delicious crab samosas. This stimulates local tourism. Through initiatives like this, the project contributes to capacity building at the community level. The outer one. Inspired by the Baso, another community project, Comensam, is also helped by KCDP. Here, mangroves are being systematically re-established. All rootstock are removed. Surface sand is scraped away. Then seedlings from their own nursery are planted and nurtured. David Taura leads the group, and his environmental awareness is evident. But he realizes there needs to be profit too.
In order to maintain or to manage this area, we are supposed to use this place sustainably, and to use it sustainably, then we have got to introduce some other things, and that is how we came to start fish culturing here, which is an income generating activity for the community.
But waste from coastal towns and villages inland poses a hazard. It can choke mangroves on the shore. So, what can be done about that? A youth group where talent lives had the idea of setting up a community waste management service, and the project supported them.
At the moment where I'm standing, there was a very big heap of waste here. And we managed with the target groups, we managed to close it down to the way you can see the face is green and clean.
Now the rubbish is collected and piled in a central location where the council truck can take it away. Otherwise, this garbage would have been washed down to the ocean, polluting and destroying mangroves and marine ecosystems on its way. Another community highlight is the Kibuyuni Seaweed Farm. A market has opened up for this treasure from the sea. The project does not simply provide funds and infrastructure. It
your slides.
Thank you. Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome to this session on the impact of climate change on Africa's fisheries. This is a continental consultation on the report, which is entitled At the Nexus of Climate Change and Marine Fisheries, Strengthening Adaptation Capacity in Africa. I'd like to welcome our distinguished guests. First, Professor Ntiba, who will be giving the keynote speech here today. I would also like to recognize the Minister of Fisheries from the Gambia, James Gomez, who has very kindly joined us here in the front row. To all of you, all the other dignitaries, and in this session, welcome. What we're going to do is we have quite a tight schedule here, so I ask the speakers please stay on schedule in terms of time. We have 9 speakers, so I'll be keeping quite a strict clock to make sure that everybody gets done on time, and we'll go from there. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is invite Professor Ntiba to please provide his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe, the country director for Eritrea, Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda at the World Bank. the entire World Bank, led by the lead natural resource management specialist, Prince. I have also noted that we have AU IBA with us here. We have also a representation from the Nordic countries. Ladies and gentlemen participants, like you've been informed, I'm Professor Ntiba, the Principal Secretary for Fisheries, Aquaculture, and the Blue Economy in the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock, Fisheries, and Irrigation. I think mine is to really welcome all of you and thank you for participating in the very important meeting that we've been having here, the Conference on Sustainable Blue Economy here in Nairobi, Kenya, where the whole world has been gathered to discuss and chart the future of where we want to be on the changing issues of climate, our ecosystems, the entire oceans, and also our other big waters. I also want to thank the bank for organizing and sponsoring this side meeting. It's a very important side meeting on climate and how it impacts on fisheries, particularly in Africa. I think you have the panelists here to assist you to discuss this subject. So I won't be discussing the subject myself. I think it's very good to have all these very able panelists to assist us discuss this subject into the future. But before we get into discussing the subject, I want to say the following. One is that I have looked at the paper that has been prepared to lead the discussions today in this meeting. And looking at it, I developed a sense that, and the fact that particularly ourselves in Kenya, and probably the rest of Africa, may have to re-engage in mainstreaming advanced studies on climate in general. How this impacts ecosystem dynamics and processes in relation to the effect on the health, the productivity, and the resiliency of oceans. I think when I thought deeply about it, it appeared to me like in the whole debate and evolution of climate discussions in the world over, we seem to have been conditioned to think more of how we as human beings respond to the changes. And entirely, I think, having forgotten the important roles oceans play, in particular, in driving the water cycle and its budget in the biosphere, and as a sink of carbon in the face of deforestation and desertification worldwide. I think that's what I thought when I looked at this paper. Ladies and gentlemen, in this regard, it appears to me also that we need to home our future efforts, especially in Africa, in looking at the nexus between green economy and the blue economy. Somehow, in the sense that we have the interconnectivity of the two economies, the green economy on land and the blue economy in our waters, in our oceans, in our seas, in our rivers. I think we need to relook as human beings how these two economies mix together. In a sense, it does appear like cleaner mechanisms on land, especially increasing tree and forest cover, would have the effect of increasing the surface area of carbon dioxide absorption capacity in the world in the first sense, and secondly also increasing tree cover and forest on land will secondarily increase the water detention capacity on land moving forward, so that we can hold it there longer in land ecosystems, not only to recharge the underground aquifers and raise the water tables everywhere in the world, but also this will significantly reduce the amount of runoff that all of us are used to nowadays. You know, every time it rains, there is always rushing of water everywhere in form of runoff, because we have reduced the capacity of that water percolating into the interstitial spaces, into the underground aquifers, and being held there. So what happens in general, and I come from a very mountainous area from the Mount Kenya region in Tharaka Nithi County, it rains, water doesn't percolate, and it runs off. The combined effects of this, in my own view, will be more forests in our water towers, and I'm glad that Kenya is continuing to discover more water towers from the known 5. I now hear there are 70 something. And the more we continue identifying these water towers, the good, the better it will be for all of us in the country. So that if we have more forest and tree cover in these water towers, the combined effect will be that we will not only have more water and cleaner water flowing through our rivers into our oceans and into our lakes and into the swamps, but also we will have less runoff. Our rivers will be clean. I remember when I was young, in those sides of Chuka where I come from, you have your legs in the water, and you'll be seeing even fish moving around your toes and whatnot. But nowadays, all the rivers, all the water is brown. And maybe you have an eyesight problem, but I think all of us agree that that is what it is. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that in the future, and probably after these meetings, governments may have to rethink, to review the targets set for forest cover in their countries from the current ones, which I think are too low. Say, for example, for Kenya, the target is 10% by 2030. I'm not quite sure why it is not 25, following the discussion as I am putting it. I was in Korea, South Korea recently, and I was amazed at the amount of forest cover in that country. I think almost 70% of that country is covered by forest. And I think my mind is tuned to see probably most of Africa looking that way. I think this is what I'm trying to say. If we did this, we are going to achieve a lot of benefits for our Mother Earth itself, our oceans, and for all of us in general. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, in as far as the future of sustainable fisheries is concerned, in terms of its capacity to contribute to food and nutrition security, having examined what happens in this country and probably in the East African region, I think I'm forming a firm belief that governments may have to spend more energy, more time, and more resources in educating fisher communities and other stakeholders, fish farmers, on the benefit of healthy water ecosystems and sustaining the resource productivity for the present and the future generation. Enforcing laws and regulations with the stakeholders with retro know-how and knowledge on the underlying principles of why we are doing what we are telling each other to do will only remain culturally and socio-economically very costly and very frustrating. I think that has been my experience as the PS of fisheries from 2008 to now. We need to educate, we need to train everybody more and more so that we have co-management rather than us versus them. It doesn't work. With these few remarks, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to welcome you once more and to thank the World Bank for sponsoring and hosting this sad event, and you, the participants, for being here in this conference and in this meeting. And I wish you fruitful deliberations. I'm very interested in this subject. I hope that we are going to see the resurgence of more science, more research in this subject in our universities and in our institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ndiba, for that very enlightening opening presentation, and I hope this is going to inspire us all to take action. Next up on the agenda is Dr. Mohammed Sise, Senior Fisheries Officer, African Union, working on the Inter-African Bureau for Animal Resources. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Professor Intiba, Principal Secretary, State Department of Fisheries, Aquaculture and Blue Economy, the representative from the Nordic country, the representative of World Bank, and distinguished delegates. On behalf of the Director of the Rural Economy and Agriculture, Dr. David Bahigwa, it gives me great pleasure and honor to give opening remarks at this side event on the impact of climate change on African fisheries. I also wish to convey the appreciation of the Honorable Commissioner of the Department of Rural Economy and Agriculture, Her Excellency the Ambassador, Mrs. Josepha Leonel Korotasako, who regrettably cannot be with us this morning because of another assignment of another engagement which she was assigned to by the chairperson of the commission. African Union consider this side event crucially important in creating awareness on the ongoing work of the World Bank by the World Bank and its partners towards consolidating and packaging climate change information underpinned by scientific evidence which relates to Africa's large marine ecosystem, fisheries, and the opportunities and implications for livelihoods in millions of fisheries-dependent coastal communities in particular. As we are aware, Africa holds much potential in achieving sustainable development through blue economic approach. However, the key to achieving the above is ensuring that proper policies and strategies are put in place for the blue economy, adopting the agenda at the highest level, and investing in the sector. In addition, public awareness on blue economy must be created and capacity built to harness the benefits of the sector. As part of the continent's blue economy, African oceans and inland waters provide significant benefits to our people. This aquatic endowment are renewable natural capital which offers the continent seemingly infinite opportunities to continue to reap benefits from these resources through time. The African Union fully embraces the concept of blue economy as encapsulated in various instruments and also in various political declarations and commitments. The Blue Economy Development Approach is fully embedded in the African Union Agenda 2063. The Lome Charter, especially the annexes to the Lome Charter, which was adopted by the Summit 2015. The African Integrated Maritime Strategy, as well as the policy framework and reform strategy for fisheries and aquaculture in Africa. The last 2 days have brought to the fore the need for African continent to rethink and reposition management systems of the aquatic ecosystem endowment towards blue economic development. However, climate change poses a great threat to achieving this goal if the necessary knowledge and capacity for mitigation and adaptation are not considered in any blue economic development strategy. That is why the African Union sincerely appreciates and places high value on this initiative by the World Bank to package and provide the scientific evidence, risk the vulnerability, and also highlight needed fisheries governance reform measures to counter the effect of climate change. The final product, as anticipated, will provide guidelines and options for informed and appropriate policy intervention with regards to climate change mitigation by the public and private sector that will be beneficial to fishing communities and EU member states, more so in terms of ensuring sustainability of fish stocks, increasing income, and food security. An important stage in this work by the World Bank is the rolling out of the outcome of the report. This side event is therefore very appropriately strategic and timely as the beginning of creating the awareness and promoting ownership of this very useful initiative by the bank. African Union is privileged to have been part of this ongoing process from the inception at in Cape Town, South Africa, to the presentation of the first draft report in Rome, Italy. As I mentioned during the Rome meeting, the African Union is ready and willing to contribute to the dissemination and promoting the ownership of the final outcome among our member states and regional institutions. With those few words, I wish to sincerely thank you for your kind attention, and God bless you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sese. Next up on our agenda is Roe Jorgensen, Program Manager, Nordic Development Fund, who's going to give us a donor's perspective on how this report fits into the development agenda for the African fisheries sector.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues. I'm from the Nordic Development Fund, and we are co-financing this study on climate change and fisheries in Africa. And today we are presenting the first part of the study. The Nordic Development Fund is owned by 5 Nordic countries, and these 5 Nordic countries all have fisheries as an important economic sector, and it's also important for food. In countries like Iceland and Norway, fish is eaten at least twice a week as a main meal. So fisheries, despite a very, very long history, is still a vital part of the economy and our culture. So we welcome this study because it provides the scientific evidence and the baseline of the present situation. Without a good baseline, it's very difficult to move forward. The baseline and the situation analysis that is coming in this first part of the study will make it possible to prioritize the future interventions and investments. The second part of the study will focus on what can be done and what should be the way forward. We believe that the way forward should be to build resilience in coastal fishing communities. You have thousands of communities along the coastline of Africa, and we need to address both the socio-economic and the natural resources resilience of these communities. So how can we do that? Well, part of the strategy should be to improve common property management of the resources, so to support the rights of access as opposed to having open access to fishing resources, which is the situation in many places today. We need to support improving the local ownership and the local responsibility for sustainable resource management, and this includes strengthening and promoting the role of local fishermen's councils or their own organizations. Most decisions regarding management of natural resources, they're made at the local level. They're not made in the Ministry of Fisheries or in other places. They're made at the local level. These are the day-to-day decisions that fishers are taking. So more focus on involving local fishing communities in the management and monitoring of their coastal and marine resources is the way forward. Studies suggest that community involvement in monitoring of the resources enhance the feeling of ownership, and it also improves governance while it builds local capacity. Moreover, local people's participation in monitoring has been shown to enhance decision making at the operational level of natural resources management. So using measures such as establishing sanctuaries or no-take zones are efficient tools to improve fish biomass, as we have seen from several studies, for example from the Philippines. No-take zones are often around coral reefs that will also benefit from being less stressed when protected and therefore become more resilient. And this is so important when we see a warming of the ocean today. Such interventions are both low cost and high impact. And combine such a strategy together with investments in the fisheries value chain, where low cost solutions such as, for example, cold storage can add value to the fish catch. At the time being, we are actually piloting a method of having cold storage off-grid using very high water with very high salt, containing very high level of salt. This is a method that is being used very much in Iceland, and so we are piloting to see whether this is an option for Africa. And this, we know that there are 600 million people without access to energy in Africa, so again, this is very relevant. And combined with is, we should also work with fishers organizations and fishing authorities to improve both registration and licensing. And we should use, now that most people in Africa are using mobile phones, we should use applications to register fish catch and improve traceability. We're doing that together with the World Bank in Mozambique. We should also support business development and financial inclusion of small-scale fishing enterprises and cooperative enterprises. One instrument is, for example, the African Guarantee Fund, which is based here in Nairobi, that provides guarantees to small and medium-sized enterprises so they can access credit in local currency in commercial banks. So all in all, a better local economy helps improve economic resilience and we grow the social resilience through organization, and we can improve the natural resources resilience through locally based management. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Owe. Right. Next up on the agenda, this is a sort of combined presentation by the World Bank team of Berenger Prince, who's currently standing up there, Charlotte de Fontenberg, who's sitting right next to me, and Vicky Lam. So they'll be interchanging as they go through this presentation.
Thank you very much, Ian. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming here today. Thank you to the Minister from Gambia for being in the room. We really appreciate this attendance. And remember, this is a consultation, so we'd like you to really listen and get back to us on that. As was mentioned by our speaker before, this is a two-part publication, and today we're sharing the first findings from the first part, and we'd like to get your input on that and also your guidance on how can we move from that first part to the second one. So that's just to put the thing in perspective. So this first part has a section on why fishery is important, and then it goes into the impact of climate change on fisheries. And remember, we're focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, so that's really our scope today. And we're not alone in that. As was mentioned before, it's a very nice partnership, and I'm going to cover that a bit. So the significance of fisheries for Africa. I mean, I'm sure most of you are very, very familiar with that already. But the truth is, if you want to have very scientific and hard evidence on how significant it is, this is difficult. And this is because we don't have much data, or they're not consistent. And being accurate and being fully representative, that has been the challenge for all of us. Also, the catch data do not typically include illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. Subsistence and recreational tend to be underestimated. So there is a range of issues, of course, with data. One thing that we think we know is the majority of profit in the post-harvest activity is I mean, we have to look at the fisheries not just from the harvest segment, but the whole value chain. I think that's something very important. So then let's look at, there's a GDP dimension, of course, but you have also jobs and food, and that's really important for Africa. Here's some estimates actually mainly from FAO. 10% of the global population derives livelihood from fisheries. Conservative estimate for Africa is 6.5 million jobs, mostly in the small-scale segment. It's job for women. The NIPAD and the FAO report from 2014 estimate the workforce at around 28%. And again, this is very conservative. I mean, this report is the best we have, and we know it's very conservative. We know there are a lot of multiplier effects to that. So those figures are probably at the low range of what we actually have. Same thing, same report. The contribution, trying to estimate the post-harvest value, we're around 20 billion, sorry. And this is looking at only the downstream activities, not the supplier and the upstream one. And I think what's important here is that most of the value comes from the small-scale segment, and that comes also with a lot of jobs. And that's actually specific for Africa. I think we have a sound issue. So fish for food, I think you heard that many times during the conference. It's really important, and I really like this map because it shows how much important it is for Africa and Asia. But Africa, more than other continents, I guess, is dependent on fish as a source of food, as a source of animal protein. So now that we have established the importance of fisheries for Africa, let me tell you a little bit the story of why we wanted to do that report. You have seen the findings of the 1.5-degree report from the IPCC. It's time, and it's already happening. This gray line in the middle, this is where we are today. And some of our ecosystems are already impacted. I think we all heard about the disappearance of warm coral reef. They're already going. We also know about coastal flooding. This is happening more and more. But this is also the case for small-scale, low-latitude fisheries. So all the fisheries in the low latitude, including Africa and in Asia, they are already impacted. We're already seeing the impact today. So, and that was confirmed by this IPCC report. So it's time to act. And the good thing also is this has been identified as a priority for Africa already. If you look at the NDCs, and this map is from FAO, if you look at the NDC, a number of countries have already identified within the NDC poverty and fisheries link. And I like again this map because that shows that Africa, more than Asia, those both continents, they really have identified fishery as a key component as part of climate change and poverty alleviation. It's also, and as was very nicely said by our speaker before, it's a priority for the African Union. It's also a priority for the World Bank because we have an increasing portfolio. We invest more and more. We supporting countries in the blue economy, in the fisheries sector in particular. Actually, fisheries is an entry point for the World Bank into the blue economy. So moving next, and we're not alone in that. It's a partnership. We're lucky to have a Nordic Development Fund to support this work, but we're working also with FAO, with IPCC. So we have actually designed this report to be able to build on the FAO report that has been released this summer, the impact of climate change on fisheries and aquaculture. It's focusing on Africa, and we actually build on the finding of that report and gone into the index. That's going to be presented in the next part of that presentation. We also work with the IPCC. We were lucky enough to be able to coordinate with the IPCC co-chair, Dr. Hans Portner, and we also worked with the academia from Africa. We had a number of technical consultations, and researchers from Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, and South Africa have taken part to those technical consultations. So it's already a consultative effort and a great partnership. Now I'd like to give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Vicky Lam, and this is really the heart of the report, so please pay attention. We want your feedback on that. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you Berenjel for the introduction. And as you can see,
Sorry. So as we can see from the Berenger's talk, she mentioned about fishery is very important for food and nutritional security for people in Africa, as well as is also important for the livelihood of for people in Africa. So as climate change is one of the major threats to our marine ecosystem, so it is very important for us to understand and also to project the impact of climate change on the marine resources, fishery, and also its subsequent impact on the human well-being. So in this talk, I would like to talk about some of the approach that we use to understand and project the potential impact of climate change on fishery and also the national economy in Africa. So please remember that our study is a broad brush pattern on the whole continent of Africa. So we are focusing on the national level for our result. So in the following talk, I would like to first talk about the modeling approach that we use to project the change in the catch potential on the fishery under climate change in each of the African region under different climate change scenarios. And also, I would like to touch a bit on how we adjust the uncertainty by using different models. And finally, I would like to talk about the risk and vulnerability of each of of climate change on national economy of the African country through fishery using different indicators. So this is the overall framework that we use for our study. This is we assess the risk and vulnerability of climate change in Africa using this risk assessment framework. This framework is first adopted in the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, and this framework combines both ecological risk and also socio-economic risk. And in this framework, we have the different components. We have four major components, that is hazard to climate change, and exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. I will talk about each of the components in the following talks in more details. And our approach is our approach to assess the ecological risk is to use simulation model to look at how it impacts on the future catch potential of the fishery in Africa. So this is the first part of study. In the first part of our study, we are trying to use the simulation model to look at how the potential change in marine catch potential in Africa. This is a simplified schematic diagram showing how we link the Earth system model to the biological models on your right-hand side. So from here, we project the change in catch potential in each of the African region under two climate change scenarios. One is RCP 2.6 that represent the low greenhouse gas emission scenario, and the other is RCP 8.5 scenario that represent the high greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And as I mentioned, we use two different biological models. One of which we call dynamic bioclimate envelope model. This is an individual-based model that is based on the characteristic of the individual species that include all of its biological characteristics and also its distribution range. And the other is we call size spectrum model. This size spectrum model, based on the size of the fish, simply is assuming that large fish will eat the small fish, and we project the catch potential in each of the exclusive economic zone of each of the country that under our study. The reason for us to use two different biological models and also two climate scenarios is to adjust the uncertainty. Because different biological models, they have different structure, assumption, and also parameters. So by doing this way, we can get a range of the change in the project catch potential in the future. And also we can look at the problems at different angles. So here are some of our results. This is a percentage change in the catch from the current status under climate change
in the midterm in the 2050s using one of the biological model, the DBEM. So for the map on your left-hand side represent the situation under the low greenhouse gas emission scenario. And the more red the color represent is the country is more being negatively impacted under climate change. So from here, we can see that the country are being more negatively impacted are mostly in the tropical region in West Africa. And from here, if the right-hand side map showing the situation under the high greenhouse gas emissions scenario. So the key message here is that if there's no effective greenhouse gas emission measure, the situation is getting worse. So you can see that the map on your right-hand side, more country will become turned into a darker red color. So the more country will be more negatively impacted here. So how about the other biological model that we use? So from here, we can also have the similar situation. On the left-hand side is the map under the low greenhouse gas emission scenario. The right-hand side is when there's a no mitigation measure. So from here, similar, although the magnitude of change is a bit different from the previous biological model, but we can see that it can also show that more countries will be more negatively impacted when there's no effective mitigation measure. And the majority of countries that are highly impacted are located in the tropical region. And we further compare the results from the two biological models by looking at the difference in the projected catch change from the two models. So what the map show you here is the difference from the projected catch potential from the two models. The map on your left-hand side is the midterm result. Although you can see that most of the country they have different magnitude in the projection. The darker the red color means the difference between the two models is larger. But you can maybe knock off. You can see that some country are highlighted with a diagonal line. Maybe you cannot see it clearly from here. Those highlighted with diagonal line meaning that the directional of change from the two models are also different. That means maybe one model project there's a positive change, the other model project is negatively change. So the key message that I want to bring here is in the longer term, although you can see the magnitude of projection from the two models may be different, but all of the countries show the same direction of change. That means they are all being negatively impacted under the two model. That is one key message that I want to bring up here. And going back to this risk assessment framework. So another way for us to look at the ecological risk is to use the ecological risk score based on the different indicator. This ecological risk score is to look at all the fish that being explored in each of the African EZ, and also we're taking into account both of the biological and ecological trails. So we use a score system. By doing so, we can look at all the country those country has high exposure to climate change, but are they exposure equally important to them, where we also taken into account the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of the marine species here. So for this model, for this ecological risk score, it is a score range from 0 to 100. As I have just mentioned, we're taking into account of all the biological and ecological trails. The biological, for example, include the body size of the fish, the distributional range, the depth range. So, and then we assess the ecological risk for each of the country based on the species that they explored. And again, from here, we can see that the country with the higher ecological risk are those countries in the tropic, both on the west and east side. That is the country highlighted with red color. So we know that those countries have higher ecological which mean that the marine species have high exposure to climate change, high sensitivity to climate change, but low adaptive capacity to the change. That means they hard to adapt to the change. So, but does this mean that the country with high ecological risk, does this mean that it is also have high risk to its socio-economics? It might not be necessary. So that's why the reason why we try to combine it with the socio-economic risk framework to look at how it also impact on the socio-economic. Again, in this socio-economic framework, we have four major components, remember, and so under each of component, we use different variables to assess whether the country highly dependent on fishery for its economy, or rather the country has the capacity to adapt to the change. Here are just some of the examples, and I'm not showing you the detail, but you can always refer to our report for more detail. So what we do here is we combine the four components together in order to estimate the risk score for each of the African country here. And from here, we come up with the socio-ecological risk indicator. And again, this score is also from 0 to 100. The country with higher score means that it has higher risk to climate change by taking into account whether they are sensitive to change or whether they have high adaptive capacity to the change. So we try to compare the score from the risk, ecological risk score with the socio-ecological risk score. On the left-hand side is the ecological risk scores I showed you earlier on. And from here we can see that some countries, they tend to have a higher ecological risk, but when we take into account of their adaptive capacity and sensitivity, maybe they have their economy are less dependent on fishery, and also they might have higher adaptive capacity. That means they might have a higher education level, or they have more other alternative jobs opportunities for the fisher, or they may have a more stable policy that leads them to have a higher socio-ecological risk score. That is something that we have done. It turns out that some countries seem to be worse when we just look at ecological risk, but they now seems okay. So in conclusion, in our study we show that a large proportion of countries in Africa, that's over 85%, have negative impact under climate change greenhouse gas scenario. And in long term, almost all countries have negative impact under the climate change. So if we don't have effective mitigation greenhouse gas emission measure, mitigating the greenhouse gas emission, that it may reduce that the impact will be worse in the long term. And from the two biological models, it seems that the magnitude of change of each country are different from the two models. But again, the key message is the direction of the change agree with each other, especially in the long-term projection from the two models. And the final message is the country with high ecological risk may not be necessarily have high socio-ecological risk if they have high adaptive capacity or their economy is less sensitive to climate change. That is some message that I would like to bring up here. And next will be Dr. Shell to talk about how these findings map the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Habari. All right. Building on these alarming results that we've heard from Vicky, obviously the situation is dire and the need for action is urgent. In one of her last slides, Vicky talked about things might change a little bit if mitigation measures are adopted, and this may have an influence on which of the scenarios are going to prevail. But that being said, as I just said, the situation is dire. So whenever you talk about climate change adaptation, the first thing people are going to talk about is the cost of adaptation. Anybody who's worked on climate change adaptation knows that. Because adapting to climate change means we're going to need to do things differently, which requires an investment and requires some costs. But I want to start this presentation by saying that based on the results that Vicky has presented, the cost of action is actually dwarfed by the cost of inaction. As in, what would happen if we just let things happen as we predict they will under the model presented by Vicky. At this stage in the process, we still have a number of important questions that we need to answer. When we were in Rome, Bérangère talked about the process we had with the IPCC, and we kept talking about adaptation. What can African countries do to try and mitigate those risks? And it was actually the head of the IPCC who pushed us back a little bit and said, let's not just talk about adaptation. And this is from our African colleagues here. Let's not just talk about adaptation. Let's also talk about mitigation. So in a way, it's a bit of a change in mindset where we know that African fisheries are going to be managed differently to account for the need to adapt, but also for the need to mitigate. And this is an area on which the bank is working currently. Just because the fishermen are the poorest or because fishing is difficult doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do to increase mitigation, to reduce the ecological hazard that Vicky talked about. Another question that we often hear is, but how certain are your models? This is why, in the process that Vicky's team has followed, they have maximized the odds of reducing the uncertainty by using different scenarios, by using different models. But nevertheless, it remains the fact that we know that there's a degree of uncertainty. And here, again at the bank, we're able to sort of draw from a team of economists, as a whole school of thought, if you will, almost like game theory, that helps us think, anticipate, and address this uncertainty. For instance, there are no-regret approaches, where we know that regardless of how much we need to spend, we're going to actually limit the amount of impacts we're going to have. The other thing is, we're talking about impacts of climate change on fisheries, but another thing that we need to always keep in mind is the focus on poverty. The twin goals of the World Bank are reducing poverty and increasing shared prosperity. And I think this is a filter that always needs to come in our mind when we think about what are we going to do. So it's not just how are we going to best address adaptation, but also how are we going to address adaptation, keeping in mind this focus on poverty. All that being said, these are very interesting questions, but they're not excuses, and we know that we need to act now. So when we talk about adaptation for fisheries, what can and what should it look like? Again, in our consultations, we've had a lot of debates about, is this about adapting fisheries to climate change, or is this about fisheries governance reform? I think most of the people in this room know how dire the global fisheries governance situation is. It's pretty worrisome in Africa. So the question is this about really focusing on adaptation, or doesn't this go in parallel or hand in glove, if you will, with the fact that we know that we have an urgent need for adaptation? And when we started thinking, so we have an urgent need to address global fisheries crisis, and we have an urgent need to address impacts of climate change. And if you think about those two streams, what are the areas where you have an overlay between those two streams? Because that might be the sort of areas where we want to invest our scarce resources. And then climate change is changing the whole fisheries governance game, because it's not just about the impacts. So Vicky talked a lot about the impacts on species in the EEZ, but we also know that ecosystems have a critical role to play in fisheries, and we also know that climate change is going to be devastating. Yesterday there was a session where we talked endlessly about mangroves and about reefs and about seagrass beds. And there's no point in focusing on trying to, for instance, fish less so we can save the stocks, if at the same time we know that climate change is going to devastate mangroves. There's a huge buzz at this conference about mangroves, and I think it's something that we need to think about and revisit, particularly in view of the fact, if you remember Bérangere's slide about the 1.5 degree, where compared to the other ecosystems, mangroves are a little bit more resilient. And then finally, it's great for all of us to be talking about, okay, we need to do something, we need action. What does this action actually look like? So what are the pathways that we can follow to to affect change. So I'm going to go back to the model that Vicky presented. Remember, she talked first about the green box, which is ecological, and then she looked at the blue box, which is socioeconomic. And then if you look at vulnerability, the last box on the right, these are actually the areas where we can work with our client countries, with our African colleagues, to try and affect change. So we can look at sensitivity and we can look at adaptive capacity. Again, remember the two maps that Vicky presented. One is ecological and socioeconomic is not the same, because even if the ecological impacts are going to be different, and we know they're going to be higher around the tropics, we also know now from this model that the degree to which the countries are dependent on fisheries, but also the degree to which fisheries management measures are in place, is going to have an impact. So it's not a foregone conclusion that just because you have some ecological impacts that are high, you're going to have socioeconomic impacts that are going to be high. You have some countries that are red on both maps, but you also have some countries that are better off from a socioeconomic standpoint for a number of reasons. So what are those reasons, and how can we draw from this explanation to encourage other countries to take similar approaches? As Bérangère said, we've been working very closely with the FAO, and Dr. Manuel Barange is going to be talking a little bit from the FAO's perspective. But what we found very interesting is this model that they have developed in the process of their major publication on climate change, which is, when you talk about adaptation, are we talking about the governments? Are we talking about the communities? Are we talking about the fishermen? What are the pathways? This is a very elegant model that tells us about what are the pathways that we can follow. How can we actually affect change? Institutional adaptation at different levels, obviously, public policies, legal, regs, livelihood adaptation. Remember my emphasis on focus on poverty. That's obviously going to be very important. And the last one is risk management. And that has to do a lot for disaster risk management. Part of climate change, as we know, every day when we watch TV, has a lot to do with resilience and adaptation to extreme events. And then we've been talking to a number of other sort of academics and organizations, and we try to unwrap a little bit this adaptive capacity. So we know that the countries need to be more adaptive, but what does it actually mean in practice? And I'm just going to talk a little bit about one thing that was very interesting that came up. We were talking about learning, and the idea was, well, surely a better educated population is going to be more able to adapt to climate change. And we still understand that, but we had a really interesting dialogue with our, I think it was our colleagues from African Union, who said, well, hold on, learning is not just academic learning. So for instance, in fisheries, the traditional knowledge of fishing communities is sometimes as great, if not greater, than the scientific knowledge. And another thing that we've heard that is very, very important for fisheries in Africa is the social organization aspect. So in Africa, more than in other geographic areas, we know the dependency, the collaboration between the fishermen, the way they work together. This is sometimes developed in beach management units or in co-management. We've heard about that already. But obviously, there is no cookie-cutter approach to what adaptive capacity needs to look like. And we at the bank, when we're thinking about the next steps and what to do about this, we recognize that we have to look at these different factors to try and better adapt our approach to how we can do this. So let me just, you don't have to go into too much detail, but because the bank doesn't work only at the fisheries level, we are looking at several aspects of the blue economy. We can look at, so you have health, education, governance, fisheries management. These are all examples of the kind of pathways that we've identified. And as Vicky mentioned, the report is actually based on a lot of comprehensive data, and we have comprehensive data for each of these elements in each country. And I think one of the final, if you will, sort of conclusions about adaptation is we recognize that it's going to be very specific to each country. So we're going to have to be very careful. I think we have to be going to be very systematic. But what we do know is we cannot wait. Thank you.
Me again. Just to conclude very, very quickly. Next steps, and a lot of it was already introduced by Charlotte. We changed a little bit the approach. At the beginning, we were only thinking about adaptation, and now I think it became clearer to us that we also need to consider mitigation. We're going to work on a number of case studies. As Shala was saying, it's kind of difficult to have a useful tool if we are at the continental scale. So we want to select key case study. We haven't decided yet. I mean, this is completely open for discussion, and so that's the next step for us. We also want to go a bit deeper into the economics of the impact of climate change and input. So we're going to take notes today from everything you're going to say. Here are the email address that if you want to send comment after this continental discussion. We're also going to work with IPCC, particularly the African regional chapter, and with the Africa Union and the EU IBAR, Africa Union Development Agency also. And with that, I thank you very much. It's it's not open yet. We have the two discussants after as a way to trigger the discussion, the guidance, the feedback, and we have two discussants that are going to follow up on that presentation. So thank you.
As Berenger just mentioned, we have two discussants. First up is Dr. Pacifica Ogala, Director of Climate Change Directorate to the Republic of Kenya, who's going to give a country perspective on this study.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Dr. Pacifica Ogola, the Director of Climate Change Programs Coordination, and also Acting Climate Change Secretary from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, the Directorate of Climate Change. And I will just start from the global perspective. I know my colleagues have already talked about it, but we are all aware that the world adopted Paris Agreement in 2015, and that the Paris Agreement actually agreed on a long-term temperature goal that will see the temperature rise to 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, while pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, again above the pre-industrial levels, by the year 2100, just to set the context. But the agreement also sets a global goal on adaptation, on enhancing adaptive capacity and strengthening resilience and reducing vulnerability to climate change. And the focus of this was to mostly address the issues of adaptation relating to vulnerable communities. And I find this report very interesting because as we do a continental risk assessment on fisheries, then we should be able to link this closely to the 2 degree and the global adaptation goal, and maybe inform the discussions around the global adaptation goal as we work on the Paris Agreement rulebook, which is the document that will show us how to operationalize the Paris Agreement. And as the previous speakers have also said, to inform the 2 degree goal by 2100, the Paris Agreement in 2015 commissioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the scientific arm of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to do a special report on what it will mean for the planet to take a 1.5 degree pathway, because there was no clarity at that point. So what the 1.5 degree report reveals, it was released in October this year, is that warming from the pre-industrial time, we have actually achieved 1 degree warming. But that is huge in terms of climate change impact and requirements for adaptation. And also that the current rate of warming is at about 0.2 degrees centigrade per decade, and that we are actually on track to exceed the 1.5 degree warming between 2030 and 2052. Yet this is what we are supposed to achieve by 2100. And that many regions of the world and seasons of the year are experiencing warming greater than the global average. And Africa in particular is experiencing a higher rate of warming compared to the global average. And so what does this mean for our oceans? I think we will not dwell into that, but the general impacts of climate change on oceans include coral bleaching, fish migrations towards the pole. In addition to many fish species are moving to respond to the ocean warming, and also this system is disrupting fisheries around the world. So as we talk, and as we talk about intensified warming around the continent, and if you link this to the migration of fish to the polar region, so the one thing that I might say is that the African fish by the end of the century might have moved to the northern areas to adapt to climate change, just on a light, on a light note. Then there's also issue of ocean acidification and higher capacity of oceans and ecosystems to adapt to the high acidity level of acidification. So the one important thing that the 1.5 degree report reveals that again has been mentioned by colleagues from the World Bank, but we cannot stop emphasizing it, is that substantially higher risk of loss of fish, corals, and other damaging changes in the marine ecosystem will happen, and that at 2 degrees we'll experience 90% loss of coral reef, and yet this is the global target under the Paris Agreement. So at 2 degrees, we're going to achieve 99% loss on coral, and at 1.5 degrees, we'll just be able to maintain about 10 to 30% of the current abundance. So you can just see the magnitude. So for Kenya, we ratified the Paris Agreement in 2016, and we took an emission reduction target of 30% against business as usual by 2030, focusing on 6 sectors, mainly energy, transport, industry, waste, agriculture, forestry. And this was also accompanied by adaptation actions, which include the fisheries resources. And to implement the Paris Agreement, Kenya passed a law, which is the Kenya Climate Change Act of 2016. And in the Act, we are required to develop a national climate change action plan to implement both local and international response measures for climate change. So we have already finalized the first implementation of the first action plan, which ran from 2013 to 2017. We've also developed our next action plan, which is running from 2018 to 2022. And the reason why we are taking like a 5-year rolling plan is because this is also aligned to our medium-term plans, which are actually the plans that are implementing our Vision 2030 development blueprint. So these plans must be aligned to the national planning process, and to ensure that all climate change issues are actually mainstreamed into the plans that are outlined in the medium-term plans. So with this, we did a separate report on mitigation technical analysis report, what it means for Kenya to achieve its Paris Agreement in the next 5 years. So we have the results of that. We also had a standalone report on adaptation technical analysis, which also highlighted the fisheries sector. So when I say we, I mean like from the directorate perspective, we are supposed to coordinate all sectors to give us the kind of results that we want, and we also expect them to be reporting on an annual basis, so that we are compiling this information and be able to monitor the progress that we are making. And in our plan, our His Excellency the President Uhuru Kenyatta also has the Big Four agenda, and of most relevant to this meeting is the one on food and nutrition security, with very high targets on what the country is going to do to achieve food and nutrition security, and fisheries resources are included in this plan. And this is also aligned with the National Climate Change Action Plan, making sure that the projects that are going to be undertaken have mainstreamed climate change issues, and also taking recognition of the fact that the fisheries sector is one of the most climate change vulnerable sectors. So the response measures in this are outlined in our action plan, but most importantly in our climate smart agriculture strategy and its framework for implementation. So the action plan actually identifies 7 priority areas that the country will focus on in the next 5 years. And interestingly, as we look at this report, about 4 priority areas are relevant. One is on food and nutrition security. The other is on a priority area under water and the blue economy. The other one is on the 10% tree cover. And with the 10% tree cover, which is a constitutional requirement, our ministry has actually fast-tracked this, and we are trying to get the 10% tree cover by 2022 instead of the constitutional requirement of the year 2030. And we've also recognized the role of mangroves and the fact that mangroves have a higher potential to sequester carbon than terrestrial trees. And we expect to achieve our NDC targets through not just terrestrial trees, but also the mangroves, given the fact that our forest sector has the highest mitigation potential. And then the fourth area, which is of relevant again to this meeting, is on energy. We are all aware that most of our fisher folks who are poor use energy, biomass energy, for frying fish or for smoking, and this has significant health impacts on women. And also, so they need to interrelate, look at the entire value chain of the fisheries sector, so that you are building resilience across the value chain, not just on the conservation of the ecosystems. And our Climate Change Act is very strict, and in several provisions mentions the importance of mainstreaming gender and intergenerational issues in anything that we undertake, and would therefore we are actually happy to hear this that the project is actually considering this, and we'd like to see this coming to fore. So, as the government of Kenya and the Ministry of Environment, we commend the bank for taking this study up. It's the first comprehensive report, in my opinion. I stand to be corrected, with long-term projections on climate change, on fisheries for Africa. And we are also happy to hear about the early findings of this report. There are indications of some high levels of uncertainty. We've been told how that has been taken care of, but in the event of uncertainty, we always advocate for precautionary principle to apply. And I'm also happy to hear one of the earlier speakers talked about fishing in the Nordic countries, and we know that the fishing in the Nordic countries particularly depend on very big maritime ships. And I was in a maritime meeting yesterday, and we are talking about expanding the maritime sector across Africa, and therefore this also should work closely to make sure that the maritime industry through the IMO actually meets its targets of emission reduction by 2050, so that as we improve our fish economy, we are also doing that in a sustainable and inclusive manner, without also compromising the needs of the poor who do not have the capacity to invest in such vessels. So we need to improve our fisheries data in order to understand the impacts. And I must say that as a country, we did not have these long-term projections, and these are going to be very useful for us as we review the action plan in the next 2 years. And we also recommend strong from this process for you to give us some lessons learned from this, and how we can and research gaps, because I believe that we will not be able to finish this analysis in one report, but also just to highlight what we need to do in terms of next steps to build resilience across the value chain, and also to inform policy. And we also particularly from the country case studies. To conclude, we hope that this project will help us roll out viable pilot projects across the continent to address sensitive ecosystems, and mostly also it will help us to see the balance between economic growth and sustainability, and growth that is inclusive, that is gender sensitive, that also takes consideration of the fisherfolk communities, which in our country, the fisherfolk communities are considered as one of the marginalized group alongside pastoralists and hunters and gatherers. But as we work on this project, I see the focus is on Africa. But we know that Africa only contributes 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we are going to achieve the 1.5 degree by 2100, or God willing less than that, then there need to be a global link to this report to show that the people who are meeting, for us to achieve this, there's need for because it's not Africa that is going to take that mitigation. The biggest chunk of mitigation is going to come from somewhere else. So we should not do this in a silo without connecting this to the global emissions and actions across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent comment. The next discussant is Dr. Manuel Baranje, Director of Fisheries and Aquaculture Policy Resource Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, who will give a technical partner's perspective on this study.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. And may I start by congratulating Kenya for the measures that you've already taken in response to climate change. I think that's already showing the way in an amazing way. So thank you very much for that measure. I've been an FAO for 2.5 years, and before that, I've been an academic working on climate change issues for 20 years or so. And a review editor of the IPCC Special Report on Oceans. And climate change is actually one of the reasons why I joined FAO, because I felt that there was a need for countries to start working together in providing solutions, and I'm talking about adaptation, and I'll say in a moment why, in a way that they are coordinated and that have a framework so that the adaptation of one country does not end up making the options of a neighboring country worse. So adaptation can be maladaptation, and the only way of avoiding maladaptation is coordination. So for that reason, the FAO and me, we're very happy to work with the World Bank in this initiative. We congratulate you in doing it. We have been present in the 2 preparatory workshops providing feedback. And as Berenger mentioned, this work has been taking place at the same time as the FAO was preparing and published in June a very significant special report on climate change on fisheries and aquaculture with country-by-country impacts throughout the world. It's a 629-page report, so I didn't bring it with me, but it's available online, and there are actually digital copies if you want in the FAO booth in the exhibition hall. And it's very well dovetailed with the World Bank work. The reason for why I'm so happy with this work is because I believe that we cannot accept the reality of climate change passively. So by passively, I mean it's not just a matter of mitigating, it's about adapting and adapting in a positive manner. It's not just about waiting for the storm to arrive. Second, it's very important the approach that you've taken, because we cannot see climate change as an environmental problem. And for a long time, it has been seen only as an environmental problem. And I've been attending climate change meetings for many years, and it was always very difficult to bring anything else than the environment issue with it. It is a socio-economic issue. It's not an environmental issue. It's an issue that has an origin in the environment, but it has socio-economic implications. The FAO report focused specifically to try to help countries develop the national determined contributions, the NDCs. Which sort of Pacifica mentioned, it's the way that countries demonstrate their commitment to the Paris Agreement by a package of measures that each country puts forward that says this is what we're going to do for mitigation, this is what we're going to do for adaptation, and in so doing we're going to contribute to limiting global warming to 2 degrees and preferably less. And like the FAO report, the World Bank report also focuses on poverty. In fact, I think the FAO report is the first one which chapter 1 is on poverty. It's a climate change report where the first chapter is on poverty. And why? Because fishers are some of the poorest in society. And second, because the link with poverty brings the need to have solutions to climate change that are people-centered. And not environment-centered, they are people-centered. And that's quite important. Also because any poverty reduction solutions are likely to be good climate change adaptation solutions. If you lift people out of poverty, they are automatically better adapted to cope. But this approach also shows, in fact, that poverty solutions cannot be single sector solutions. We're focusing on fisheries and aquaculture for sure, but there have to be a multi-sectoral context in which they operate and a multi-dimensional context. Scale is crucial for adaptation. You have to know what you're adapting to, and it's not just the global warming, it's what happens down at the village where a particular community depends on a resource that might go away. So what we have learned so far from both the World Bank work and the FAO work, first is that I do not see adaptation as a protection umbrella issue. It's not about protecting. So the classical view that when you have uncertainty, you need to be more conservative into responses might not actually work with adaptation. You need to be innovative and creative. If you do that, then it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. What do I mean by that? It's not about limiting the impact. It's about using that impact as a positive force to develop new ideas, to develop innovation. In that way, you can end up with a positive response, not just a limited impact. And that conceptually is sometimes difficult to understand, but it can be very easily proved by examples. For example, everyone talks about resources moving away. Well, they move away from somewhere, which means that they move into somewhere else. How do you respond to that? Right? So that is important. Now, the second thing is, third thing, is that adaptation is place-based. You cannot have the same adaptation for everybody. Adaptation has to be fixed to the place where it's going to be implemented. It's also scale dependent. So the adaptation at country level is not the same as the adaptation at province level, and certainly not at community level. And we also need to adapt to the probable rather than the possible. Why do I say that? If you look at the World Bank report and the FAO report, there is significant uncertainty on the specificities of the impact of climate change on particular species or even particular areas. You can have, in the FAO report shows it I think very nicely, you could have a country where overall you expect a decrease in catch potential, but in some areas inside the country you see an increase. So the scale matters a lot. Not all impacts are negative, and adaptation is even more needed when the adaptation is positive. So if a resource arrives to your waters, you have the frameworks, the legal frameworks, you have the management plans, you have the institutions to deal with it. If you suddenly have a resource that is shared with another country, do you have the transboundary measures in place, institutionals and in terms of management tools? So I'm almost finished because I think it's important to get people to talk. A crucial element of this report is going to be how to implement it. And we are very happy, the FAO is very happy to work with the World Bank and partners to implement it in the best possible way. We have to avoid academic exercises, which there are many of those. Vulnerability frameworks are useful to understand the problem, but they are not problem solvers. So the FAO, for example, has a very simple triad of interventions for adaptation, which is you first adapt institutions and management tools. Second, you adapt livelihoods. And third, you adapt for risk management and resilience. And each one of these three, you have a list of very specific measures that you can take to adapt. You have to move to practical approaches and not focus on academic exercises. Happy to work with everyone on this. Happy to hear what other people say and think about the report and what we need to do in terms of responding to adaptations. And I'll just finish with the one word, and that I believe that we can make this positive if we are innovative and ambitious in our responses and not just being negative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very practical advice. Now we're moving into question time. So, any takers? Where are the mics, first of all? Yeah, one technical note here. We do have translation. So if you feel more comfortable asking a question in your own language, please do that. And we have translation devices at the back if you don't already have one. Okay, so the mic is.
Thank you very much, Berenger.
Please also introduce yourself and,
yes.
and direct the question to the person you would like to answer.
Yeah. My name is Andrew Bayo, resource economist from the University of Australia. Thank you very much for the presentation. I want to know if the data was disaggregated at species level, because in Africa you have pelagic species that are very sensitive to temperature changes and salinity, and they form the bulk of the stock that underpin food security. So I want to know if and we can see differences in vulnerability if the data was disaggregated, especially when there are food security implications.
So we'll take 3 questions. Put the woman next to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I am Khadija Tijalo, the Director of Fisheries in Sierra Leone. From the report, it seems like it was modeling, but I wanted to know the World Bank project, of which Sierra Leone is part of. Data collection is an issue, and I know that the World Bank would say it's very expensive. But I think we have to do it, because for stock assessment now, we are trying to get some data. But for climate change and fisheries, we have to maybe do it at the regional level for the World Bank project, collect the data, so that adaptation and mitigation will be done with other stakeholders, because it's not a fisheries problem alone. We have been talking about agriculture, like the cutting of mangroves, the forest. It affects the distribution of the species, the spawning ground and everything. So I think co-management or multi-sectoral should be part of the program, and it should include other institutions so that the project can collect the data, not only modeling aspect, but it should be part of maybe, I don't know if Berenger will talk about it, it should be maybe our next phase 2, we should collect the data, although I know it's expensive. Thank you.
Okay, in the front row here.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Jared Ogada. I am from the University of Nairobi in Kenya, Kenya. Now, I just had a concern on the area of, in regard to our fishing industry. Number one, I wanted to ask about most of our fishermen are usually poor people from the village level and the people who live in the oceans. So I will direct the question to maybe World Bank, Dr. Shuka, if you can address the need to have rural capacity building to our fishermen, and also their role to educate them, because most of them don't understand issues of climate change that usually affect their fishing way of life. So if they can be given some capacity building in regards to how the fishing industry can be well, trying to address their issues of concern as fishermen, and also to try and see the ways of how they can understand the issues of climate change at the rural level, because climate change usually affects the fishing industry, especially to the fishermen. Number two is just a concern to if you can prioritize issues of indigenous communities, because the indigenous communities are the ones who are involved with the whole cycle about blue economy, and maybe by giving them some value addition. I don't know if there can be a program for value addition for the indigenous communities at the ocean level. Yeah, and maybe to introduce things like marine academies along the coastal line, so that people can be educated on how to have fishing inputs and how to sustain the fishing industry and aquatic life, because we are dealing with the life underwater and also life within water. Yeah, I think those are my enough question. And final, sorry, before I finish, the role of women, because women also play important role in fishing industry. So I would like to suggest that if women can be given capacity from being assumed to being affirmed by the local and regional government, because they are the greatest stakeholders in fishing industries, especially in Africa. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take those three questions, and then we'll go to the next three. So, the first question was on disaggregation of species, which I guess.
Thank you very much for the question. So I'd like to address this gentleman's question about looking at just for the pelagic species, as pelagic species is one of the major species that catch in most of the African country. So I think it is a really good idea, and also it's possible for a model as a model. So both of them, as you may remember, one of the biological model is on the species-based, individual species-based model. So it is based on different biological characteristics of each of the species, so including the growth parameter, the distribution range, the depth range. So we have the information for each of the species that explored in each of the year sets. So we have the information how they change in the catch in the future, and this information may be able to pass through the fishers, so they can be able to adapt to those kind of adaptive measure, so they can foresee how the catch will be changed in the future. This is something is possible to do for our model. Thank you.
So I'm taking the second question from Ms. Diallo. Thank you for Sierra Leone for the big representation today. I think you made very good suggestion. I mean, monitoring is indeed one important part of addressing the issue by just better monitoring it. So, and your suggestion to improve data collection and preferably within a regional context is completely in line with the report. And indeed that is included also in the World Bank finance project, including in Sierra Leone. Thank you. Last question.
Okay, well, why don't you start?
I just wanted to touch on the issue of education and capacity building, and just many of you will be aware of the Dr. Fridtjof Nansen program, the FAO Norway program that goes mostly around Africa, serving fish resources. I mean, this phase, the current phase of the Fridtjof Nansen has a climate change element, which means that every time that they do the capacity development ashore as well as on board, climate change is part of the curriculum. So that's in place. But I wanted to have, if I may, a very quick example of the role of women and how you can make positive adaptations in that regard. In April, I was in Zanzibar, where we are helping a community of seaweed farmers, which are all women. And they had approached FAO because they said that climate change was affecting the seaweeds and it was creating disease, and seaweed were not growing any longer. So we showed to them that the way of solving this problem was to move the seaweed farms 1 kilometer offshore, where the water is colder and it was working fine. The problem is that the women didn't know how to swim. So now we have NGOs teaching the women to swim. So now they have managed to solve the problem of climate change, although for the time being, the seaweeds are growing, and now on top of being still the breadwinners, now on top they can swim. So that's a plus plus.
I'm going to take the question on the indigenous communities and the role of women. You're absolutely right to highlight these two very important considerations. I would say that on the role of women, we tend to think about women in the post-harvest sector, which is where the highest value generation happens, but they actually play a much greater role in terms of investment, in terms of helping, usually their husbands get out at sea. So I think it's an understudied or considered element, but I will say that it actually applies to the whole blue economy, not just fisheries. And I'm just going to pitch, I am giving a presentation at 11:30 in Savo on inclusive blue economy, and I'm going to talk about gender equity, climate equity, intergenerational equity.
Over there, man with the white shirt on the far back. Yes, you have your hand up. Where's the mic? Okay. On your right, left hand side.
Hello. Okay. I missed most of the earlier presentation. My question is to the bank. The new Pro Blue Fund, trust fund that's just been set up and is accumulating money. Will African countries be able to, access this preferentially to address this problem? I'm thinking of, university centers that may need grants to do studies, etc., etc. I worked at the bank before, so I know how complex it is. You may not have the answer, but could you speculate on that?
Sure, it's all yours. Yeah, let's, okay, so let's go to the far left over there, and then you're next.
Good morning, my name is Ishete Dejan. I'm fisheries expert at the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD. Thank you for the briefing. The IGAD region is the most affected when it comes to your modeling, especially ecological risks. That includes the Somalia, Kenyan waterside. But I didn't see the engagement of universities or academia on this. Maybe it will be important to include them. And the other issue, in IGAD region, which we have 8 countries, the most important fisheries is inland fisheries, which accounts 90%. Does this model include it? I didn't see it much, because only less than 10% is, when you look at the landing, is from marine. So I'm afraid we need to consider the inland fisheries. The other issue, the climate change impact is a luxury for IGAD region, because we have a very big threat now, IUU fishing, which will affect our adaptation mechanism. Only in Somalia waters, we lose $500 million only in Somalia waters. So, and I don't see much investment from the bank and the others when it comes to the Horn of Africa in terms of improving the livelihood of the fishing community and the sort of long-term sustainable investment. Thank you.
Yeah, in the front row here.
Professor Alo from Nigeria. I teach at the University of Lagos in the Faculty of Science. So even though I'm not a fisheries expert, but I'm close to the Marine Science Department in my university. The UBC data on Nigeria in the predictive is very scary. Very scary. That I spoke with Rashid firstly to say, I hope it's been validated with some data to some extent. And he says, yes, preliminary data has validated that model finding. And then I said, of course, we will need more information, more data. But even at that, I'm glad we're sitting in the room with people from the bank. Charlotte, you can see that there is some challenge with respect to fisheries in Nigeria. Fish still continues to be the mainstay of the protein supply to large coastal dwellers, large populations. And true, we find that we see dwindling fish catch. That's not in doubt. Because, I mean, I sleep and wake up right beside the Lagos Lagoon. The University of Lagos is located right beside the Lagos Lagoon. So we see what the fish catch is practically when the fisher folks return in the evening with their canoes. And that moves me straight away to my FAO colleague, that fantastic to hear from you, that poverty reduction strategies are good adaptation strategies. But I want to turn that around and say, why don't we think of adaptation strategies, introducing it as a poverty reduction strategy? Because as you do know, in our economy, in our systems, people have challenges in deciding on or even appreciating what poverty reduction strategies should go into place. So why don't we then turn it around? And I'm urging the FAO to think of that. That let's introduce adaptation strategies. And I can see that obviously Charlotte and her colleagues at the bank will require some of those strategies the FAO you just told us about implementing. Because truly I'm with you. And throughout this meeting, everywhere I have spoken, I have talked about the fact that we should do less talking. Let's see implementation. Our people want to see action. So call for action, implementation is very, very important. That I want to challenge you that I hope the FAO, maybe you sit in Rome, but the African office, the Nigerian office, are doing things in introducing the implementation strategies and adaptation strategies the FAO has come up with, which I believe can work because I've had a quick look at what kind of strategies being suggested by FAO. They will work, but then they need to be mainstreamed. They need to go down the line from remaining academic to getting the fisheries offices to be able to come to terms with that, which is why I buy into the capacity building issues that you brought up, that truly we need to educate the fisher folks. We need to turn the adaptation strategies you excellently talked about into action points at the local level. I thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's answer these three questions and then we can move on to others next.
Could we start program?
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. I will take the program question by starting with thanking our colleague from the Nordic Development Fund. ProBlue was just launched by the World Bank in order to support its Blue Economy Action Plan, and it's just targeted not just at fisheries but also at other sectors of the blue economy, and the Nordic countries have played a key role in helping us launch that trust fund. It will become operational shortly, and it will basically operate through our client countries. The demands are going to come from the governments, and these countries may then call upon their scientific institutions to help out. So the details are still being worked out. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about IUU fishing. You're absolutely right. IUU fishing is one of the scourges of fisheries governance. And I will say that we are actually engaged in Somalia, we're engaged in Kenya, we're engaged throughout the Horn of Africa and Djibouti as well. So these are things that we're working on. I would just remind you that World Bank involvement always depends on demand from the client countries.
To respond about the scope of the study, I think that was put in the presentation somewhere. It's marine fishery. You're right. Inland fishery is really important. We had to start somewhere, and we wanted to limit the scope of the study in order to be able to have more valuable and reliable results. So that's and about working with academia, we have worked with academia. The data come from university most of the time, and that Vicky can elaborate on that. And when we prepared that report, the technical consultation, we always had researchers from African university. So we've done that. Do you want to add anything?
Yes, as Berenger mentioned, we work closely with the university here, and also because we also exchange some data with them, and I would like to also address the last point of this gentleman about Nigeria. It looks scary on the map, but as Manuel mentioned, it's all skill dependent. So because now I'm talking about the country level. The assessment. So if the country have a more detailed data, I think the next land of the World Bank would like to do some more case study to using the more detailed data to further assess the risk within the country. And also, one of the things is that this risk score they are static, but in reality we are not static. The country will improve their adaptation measure, so the score will be improved as times go by. That's it.
Okay, can we go to the in?
Yes, I just want to reply to the gentleman from Nigeria. Yeah, that's certainly we have to not look at adaptation as just reacting to some kind of outside threat. We actually need to turn it around, and we need to talk more about resilience, building resilience, because that's the way forward. And because if you build resilience, I mean, when climate change is having impacts, then you are much stronger, and you have the different tools to actually move on from it. So we build a better governance of the natural resources at the local level. We invest in stronger organizations. We invest in the value chain. And again, we invest also in capacity building, and that capacity should not necessarily be going to formal courses, I mean PowerPoint presentations and stuff like that, but rather have places where we can see that there are very good cases of locally based management and good cases of also improving your value chain. Then let's pay the cost of actually bringing these communities together so that they can use the method of like farmer field schools, simply having fisher to fisher show what works and how we have done it, and this could be of inspiration to other places. Thank you.
Just very briefly to Professor, I cannot respond either by saying, well, I can only say that I agree fully with you. That FAO works, as you know, FAO has regional and sub-regional offices in Africa, in Accra, in Cairo, in Harare, and in Addis, and FAO representatives in every country in Africa. And the way that we work is that the FAO rep in each country is the one that is supposed to engage with the government in identifying what the government wants. And then that FAO rep links with the regional office, where we have fisheries offices in every one of those offices, and with headquarters in Rome when there is need for technical support. And that's what we do, is a practical implementation. We are not interested in pure academic developments, we're interested in changing things on the ground. Thank you.
Okay. Any further? Why are the women not asking any questions here?
My sister right there. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you very much to the presenters. Based on the presentations made, it is clear that 85% of Africans are vulnerable to climate change, and also that climate change is a threat or a challenge to the blue economy. And I want to also appreciate the World Bank for the project being implemented in Sierra Leone. Let me introduce myself. I'm Ajakari Sise, the Executive Director for Climate Change, Environment and Forest Conservation Consortium, a civil society advocacy network on the environment from Sierra Leone. What I realized on the World Bank project is that there are three components: the governance, the IUU, and the value addition. And the climate change component is a small component under the governance component. I want to recommend here that since climate change is a threat to the blue economy, I want to recommend to World Bank to let climate change stand alone as a component, to be component 4 of the project. So that's my submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's see. Is there anybody else out there? Let's go to the back. That gentleman in the blue and the grey jacket. Yep, there you go. Who's that?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Joseph Kinidza. I'm a researcher from South Africa. I was looking now at this global carbon atlas. It shows the list of the major polluters or the emitters, and I really appreciate those projections and those scenarios. I like science, but like as you were saying, that we are more interested in the solution part. From the maps that were projected there, Central Africa is the one that, from what I'm hearing now, is supposed to be adapting more or creating measures to adapt to mitigate, while they're actually among the least emitters. They are actually more of victims, if I may put it that way, which drives me to my question on the role of the Nordic Development Fund and the World Bank at the political level. I understand their role at scientific level, funding those research, but at the political level, because I have a feeling that climate change has a lot to do with political decisions rather than the scientific, because most of what is presented there has already been known. It's just that now the details are finer. But decisions like, for example, investments in some energy mixes, it's mostly political decisions. So what is the role or the involvement of these funding bodies at the political level?
John Henry is my name, from African Nazarene University, a local university in Kenya. I'll pose the questions to all of you. We have developments of infrastructures that need to be checked along the coastal region in all of our countries. For example, we have mines in the seas that I think will affect this. They affect climate change. For example, in Kenya, we have the proposed Lamu coal. Then we have countries that mine oil that contributes to climate change. So what is the role of World Bank? Whenever they're financing such, what they have proposals put for them. Then two, from a university setup, one of the challenges we have is dissemination of the findings that we have to the locals, because they're the people who are going to implement this. How can we use our university students? How can we use our high school students and primary school students? when we simplify this work so that they can go back to their homes and villages and act on it. Then the last one, what is the role of indigenous knowledge in intervention on this? The traditional people have ways in which they were adapting and mitigating these factors. How can we embrace that? Thank you.
Sorry? Yeah. Okay.
I take the first question from Sierra Leone. I really like the idea of having a standalone climate change proposal. I don't promise this is possible, but we'll look into it. So thank you for the suggestion. Yes.
Right. So yeah, on fossil fuels. I've been given this job since I'm the most senior person from the bank. Yes, it's always a very tricky issue. Generally speaking, the bank does not finance any fossil fuels. Most of our energy program now is going into alternative energy. We see fossil fuels as a dying energy source, and we've had a lot of success in instituting alternative energy programs. Some in Africa. Zambia had a very successful auction probably 6 months or a year ago. Probably one of the cheapest, which has really set the ball going on getting solar plants built in a lot of different places around the world. From time to time, some countries have no other alternative other than to use fossil fuels, and we have in the past considered some of those as options. We can't be too holy on some of these things. So. In situations where there's absolutely no other alternative, the bank does from time to time consider fossil fuels. But as a rule, our president's been out stating that really he just doesn't want to do this kind of stuff anymore. So that's the sort of short summary of where it is. But it's always a complicated issue. Same issue with hydro. We sometimes get some criticism for doing hydro projects as an energy source. And so, in those situations, we sort of customize those solutions and look for alternatives, look for the best ways to do it if we have to do it. And we have what we call a mitigation hierarchy whenever we do these kind of environmentally sensitive projects, which I don't know if many of you know, but we've recently updated all of our environmental safeguard policies, which are now called our environmental social framework, which we issued, and it went into effect on October 1st, which is sort of the upgraded version of our safeguards policies. We're always learning. We're always improving our safeguards policies as we go, and we try and adapt those to the capacity and the ability of our clients to implement them. So that's a summary of where we are on these issues.
On traditional knowledge, just to agree completely with what you said, the importance of tapping into the sort of knowledge, and that's why I had the slide where I was looking at the different, we were talking about knowledge. It's not just teaching anything, it's also about recognizing what they already know and using it to the best of our abilities.
Just to add on to Charlotte's comment on indigenous knowledge, indigenous knowledge is very important, but the challenge we are having is that this is not well documented. So I think the documentation part and so that this knowledge is able to be transferred from one generation to another would be a good project for us. I mean, for not within the World Bank project, but something to consider, because this is very good knowledge, but we don't have it written.
Anyway, Manji's in charge of things here. She's sitting in the front row, my colleague from the World Bank, who is our external relations person, who's done a lot of the background work and has been managing some of the outreach on this particular program. But anyway, she controls the time, and she's told me no more questions. So we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you very much for coming. I think we've certainly learned a lot from our team here and our panelists, and certainly from our people asking very interesting questions here. So I won't spend much time. I was assigned to sort of summarize things here, but I think our technical people have done a really excellent job here, and so I'll just wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. We need to leave the room so that we can prepare for the other event. excuse me, we need to vacate the room so that we can prepare for the other event.